Jamal Khashoggi was born on October 13, 1958, in Medina, Saudi Arabia, into a family that embodied the complex intersection of tradition and modernity that would define much of his life. His grandfather, Mohammed Khashoggi, had served as personal physician to King Abdulaziz Al Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, establishing the family's connection to the highest levels of the Saudi establishment. This privileged background provided Jamal with access to elite circles from an early age, yet it would also create expectations and constraints that would shape his career trajectory in unexpected ways. Growing up in Saudi Arabia during the 1960s and 1970s, Jamal witnessed his country's rapid transformation from a traditional desert kingdom into a modern oil-powered state. The massive wealth generated by petroleum exports was reshaping Saudi society, creating new opportunities while also generating tensions between traditional Islamic values and Western-influenced modernization. These contradictions would become central themes in Jamal's later journalism, as he sought to understand and explain the forces transforming the Arab world. Jamal's early education took place in Saudi Arabia, where he demonstrated exceptional intelligence and a natural curiosity about the world beyond his homeland's borders. He was particularly drawn to literature and writing, showing an early aptitude for the clear, compelling prose that would later make him one of the Arab world's most respected journalists. His family's connections opened doors to educational opportunities that were not available to most young Saudis, including exposure to Western ideas and perspectives that would profoundly influence his worldview. The formative years of Jamal's intellectual development coincided with a period of significant political upheaval in the Middle East. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War had shattered Arab confidence and prompted widespread soul-searching about the future direction of Arab societies. The rise of political Islam, exemplified by movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, offered one answer to these challenges, while secular nationalism and Western-style liberalization provided alternative paths. Jamal absorbed these competing ideologies, developing a nuanced understanding of the complex forces shaping his region. Jamal's higher education took him to Indiana State University in the United States, where he studied business administration in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This American educational experience was transformative, exposing him to democratic values, free press traditions, and open intellectual discourse that were largely absent from Saudi society. The contrast between American academic freedom and the restrictions on expression in his homeland made a lasting impression, planting the seeds of his later advocacy for press freedom and democratic reform in the Arab world. During his time in the United States, Jamal developed friendships with fellow Arab students who shared his interest in politics and social change. Many of these relationships would prove enduring, creating a network of contacts across the Arab world who would later become sources and collaborators in his journalistic work. The experience of living as a minority in American society also gave Jamal insights into issues of identity and belonging that would inform his later writing about Arab communities both within the Middle East and in diaspora. The early 1980s were a crucial period in Middle Eastern politics, with the Iranian Revolution of 1979 having sent shockwaves throughout the region. The rise of Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic challenged the established order in multiple ways, offering both an inspiration to those seeking religious-based governance and a threat to existing power structures. For young Arab intellectuals like Jamal, the Iranian Revolution raised fundamental questions about the relationship between Islam, politics, and modernity that would remain central to regional discourse for decades to come. Jamal's American education also coincided with the early stages of the Afghan conflict, where Soviet forces were battling Mujahideen fighters backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other allies. This conflict would later play a crucial role in Jamal's career, as he became one of the few journalists to report extensively from Afghanistan during the anti-Soviet struggle. His American educational background gave him unique insights into Western perspectives on the conflict, while his Saudi identity provided access to the religious and financial network supporting the Afghan resistance. Upon returning to Saudi Arabia in the early 1980s, Jamal began his journalism career at a time when the kingdom was experiencing significant internal and external pressures. The Iranian Revolution had created a new source of regional instability, while the ongoing Iran-Iraq War was drawing Saudi Arabia deeper into regional conflicts. Domestically, the kingdom was grappling with the aftermath of the 1979 seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by religious extremists, an event that had shaken the foundations of Saudi religious and political authority. Jamal's early journalistic work focused on these regional conflicts and their implications for Saudi Arabia and the broader Arab world. He demonstrated a remarkable ability to gain access to key political and religious figures, leveraging his family's connections while building his own reputation as a serious and trustworthy journalist. His reporting combined careful attention to factual detail with insightful analysis of the deeper political and social forces driving events. The defining moment of Jamal's early career came with his coverage of the Soviet-Afghan War, which began in earnest in the mid-1980s. Unlike most journalists who covered the conflict from Pakistan or other neighboring countries, Jamal actually traveled into Afghanistan with Mujahideen fighters, providing first-hand accounts of the war that were rare in Arabic-language media. His reporting brought him international attention and established his reputation as one of the Arab world's most capable conflict journalists. Jamal's Afghan reporting was notable not just for its access and detail, but also for its perspective on the role of Islamic faith in motivating the resistance fighters. At this time, Jamal was sympathetic to the Islamic movement and saw the Afghan struggle as part of a broader awakening of Muslim consciousness. His reporting portrayed the Mujahideen as heroes fighting both Soviet communism and Western materialism, themes that resonated strongly with Arab audiences who were themselves struggling with questions of identity and authenticity. During his time covering the Afghan conflict, Jamal developed a relationship with Osama bin Laden, who was then a relatively unknown Saudi financier supporting the Mujahideen effort. Bin Laden was not yet the global terrorist figure he would later become, but rather one of many wealthy Arabs who had come to Afghanistan to support what they saw as a righteous struggle against Soviet occupation. Jamal's interviews with bin Laden during this period provided some of the earliest detailed portraits of the man who would later orchestrate the September 11 attacks. The relationship between Jamal and bin Laden was complex and would later become a source of controversy and misunderstanding. Some critics would attempt to portray Jamal as a bin Laden sympathizer or even supporter, but this characterization oversimplified the nature of their connection and ignored the evolution of both men's thinking over subsequent decades. In the 1980s, bin Laden was viewed by many, including the U.S. government, as a legitimate supporter of the anti-Soviet resistance. Jamal's interviews with him were professional journalistic encounters, not expressions of personal or ideological alignment. As bin Laden's views became more extreme and his methods more violent, Jamal became increasingly critical of him and the terrorist movement he represented. By the 1990s, Jamal was writing articles that explicitly criticized bin Laden and warned about the dangers posed by his extremist ideology. This evolution in Jamal's thinking reflected his broader intellectual journey from early sympathy with Islamic political movements toward a more nuanced understanding of the need for democratic governance and respect for human rights. The persistent attempts to link Jamal with bin Laden would later be used by his critics to discredit his journalism and justify harsh treatment of him by Saudi authorities. These efforts to weaponize their historical connection ignored the clear evolution in both men's thinking and the fundamental differences in their ultimate worldviews. While bin Laden embraced violence and extremism, Jamal consistently advocated for peaceful reform and democratic change. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Jamal's career flourished within the Saudi media establishment. He held senior editorial positions at several prominent newspapers and magazines, including Al Watan, where he served as editor-in-chief. His work during this period demonstrated his ability to navigate the complex constraints of Saudi media while still producing journalism that was informative and occasionally critical of government policies. Jamal's success in Saudi media was built on his unique combination of insider access and analytical capability. His family connections and personal relationships with key political figures gave him insights that were unavailable to most journalists, while his writing skills and international perspective allowed him to present these insights in compelling and accessible ways. He became known as one of the few Saudi journalists who could write authoritatively about both domestic and international affairs. During his tenure at various Saudi publications, Jamal consistently pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable journalism in the kingdom. He wrote critically about government policies when he believed they were misguided, though always within the bounds of what the authorities would tolerate. His articles often called for greater transparency, accountability, and public participation in governance, themes that would become more prominent in his later work. Jamal's editorial leadership at Al Watan was particularly notable for its attempt to create space for more open discussion of controversial topics. Under his guidance, the newspaper published articles that challenged conventional wisdom on various subjects, from foreign policy to social issues. However, this editorial approach sometimes brought him into conflict with government censors and conservative religious authorities who preferred more traditional and deferential coverage. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks marked a watershed moment for Jamal's career and thinking. The fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals created enormous pressure on the kingdom to examine its own role in promoting the ideologies that had motivated the attacks. For Jamal, who had witnessed the early development of the extremist movements that produced al-Qaeda, the attacks prompted deep reflection on the relationship between Islamic political thought and violence. In the years following 9/11, Jamal's writing became increasingly critical of religious extremism and the social and political conditions that fostered it. He argued that Arab societies needed to undertake fundamental reforms to address the grievances and distortions that extremist movements exploited. His analysis focused not just on security measures, but on the need for political liberalization, economic development, and social modernization. Jamal's post-9/11 journalism also reflected a growing appreciation for democratic values and human rights. His earlier sympathy for Islamic political movements evolved into support for more inclusive and pluralistic approaches to governance. He began arguing that Arab societies could and should embrace democratic principles while maintaining their Islamic identity and cultural authenticity. This ideological evolution sometimes put Jamal at odds with both government authorities and religious conservatives in Saudi Arabia. Government officials were suspicious of his calls for political reform, while religious conservatives criticized his apparent embrace of Western political concepts. Navigating these competing pressures required considerable skill and often forced Jamal to express his ideas in subtle and indirect ways. As Jamal's journalism gained international attention, he became a sought-after commentator on Middle Eastern affairs for Western media outlets. His ability to explain complex regional dynamics to international audiences, combined with his insider knowledge of Saudi politics, made him a valuable contributor to publications like The Washington Post, The Guardian, and various television networks. This international profile was both an asset and a liability for Jamal. On one hand, it gave him a platform to reach global audiences and influence international understanding of Middle Eastern issues. On the other hand, it made him more visible to Saudi authorities who were increasingly suspicious of journalists who criticized the kingdom in foreign media. Jamal's international writings often focused on themes that were sensitive for Saudi authorities, including human rights, political reform, and the need for greater transparency in governance. While he generally avoided direct personal attacks on senior officials, his criticism of government policies was clear and sometimes sharp. His articles in The Washington Post, in particular, reached influential policymakers and opinion leaders in Washington, D.C., giving his criticism significant impact. The tension between Jamal's international profile and his relationship with Saudi authorities came to a head during the early years of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's rise to power. The young prince's ambitious reform program, known as Vision 2030, included significant social and economic changes but maintained strict limits on political expression and dissent. Jamal's calls for political liberalization were increasingly seen as challenges to the Crown Prince's authority and vision for the kingdom's future. The emergence of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler in the mid-2010s marked a new chapter in the kingdom's political development and in Jamal's relationship with the Saudi establishment. The young prince pursued an aggressive program of social and economic reforms while simultaneously consolidating power and cracking down on dissent in unprecedented ways. Initially, Jamal was cautiously optimistic about some aspects of MBS's reform program. The Crown Prince's efforts to modernize Saudi society, including allowing women to drive and opening the kingdom to international entertainment and tourism, aligned with changes that Jamal had long advocated. However, he became increasingly concerned about the authoritarian methods used to implement these reforms and the complete absence of political liberalization in the Crown Prince's vision. Jamal's criticism of MBS's approach focused on several key areas. He argued that genuine reform required not just social and economic changes, but also political openness and respect for human rights. He was particularly critical of the Crown Prince's intolerance for dissent and his use of harsh measures against anyone who questioned his policies or methods. The November 2017 arrest of numerous Saudi princes, ministers, and businessmen in what was characterized as an anti-corruption campaign marked a turning point in Jamal's assessment of MBS's rule. While corruption was indeed a serious problem in Saudi Arabia, Jamal and other observers noted that many of those detained were potential rivals to the Crown Prince's power rather than simply corrupt officials. This event crystallized Jamal's concerns about the increasingly authoritarian direction of Saudi governance under MBS. By early 2017, Jamal's position in Saudi Arabia had become increasingly untenable. His criticism of government policies, particularly in international media, had made him a target of official displeasure. He was banned from writing in Saudi publications and faced restrictions on his travel and public activities. The atmosphere of fear and repression that accompanied MBS's consolidation of power made it clear that independent journalists and intellectuals were no longer welcome in the kingdom. The final straw came when Jamal was informed that he was no longer allowed to write for any publication or appear on television, effectively ending his career as a journalist within Saudi Arabia. Faced with this professional death sentence, he made the difficult decision to leave his homeland and seek opportunities elsewhere. This decision was particularly painful because it meant leaving behind family, friends, and the society that had shaped his identity and career. Jamal's departure from Saudi Arabia was not a dramatic flight or escape, but rather a gradual transition that began with extended stays abroad for professional purposes. However, as it became clear that the restrictions on his activities were permanent rather than temporary, these extended stays became a form of voluntary exile. He eventually settled in the United States, where he could continue his journalistic work without fear of direct government interference. The decision to leave Saudi Arabia was emotionally devastating for Jamal, who had always seen himself as a loyal Saudi citizen who wanted to contribute to his country's development and progress. In his later writings, he frequently expressed his love for Saudi Arabia and his hope that he would eventually be able to return to a more open and tolerant society. His criticism of the Saudi government was motivated not by hostility to his homeland, but by his belief that the kingdom could and should do better. Settling in the United States as a self-imposed exile, Jamal joined the Washington Post as a contributing columnist, a position that provided him with a prominent platform to continue his commentary on Middle Eastern affairs. His columns for the Post were widely read and influential, reaching policymakers, academics, and opinion leaders around the world. This platform allowed him to continue his work as a journalist and public intellectual, even though he could no longer operate within Saudi Arabia. Jamal's Washington Post columns covered a wide range of topics, from regional conflicts to human rights issues to the broader challenges facing Arab societies in the modern world. However, his most impactful writing focused on the situation in Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's leadership. His insider knowledge of Saudi politics, combined with his analytical skills and moral clarity, made his criticism particularly effective and difficult for Saudi authorities to dismiss. One of Jamal's most significant contributions during this period was his analysis of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia was leading a military intervention against Houthi rebels. Jamal's columns highlighted the civilian casualties and suffering caused by the conflict, challenging the Saudi government's narrative that the intervention was necessary and successful. His writing helped bring international attention to the Yemen crisis and contributed to growing criticism of Saudi policy. Jamal also wrote extensively about human rights issues in Saudi Arabia, particularly the arrest and harassment of women's rights activists, intellectuals, and religious minorities. His columns documented the contradiction between the Crown Prince's claims to be modernizing Saudi society and the reality of increased repression against those who advocated for the very changes that MBS claimed to support. During his time in exile, Jamal's personal life became increasingly complex and, ultimately, vulnerable to exploitation by those who wished him harm. He had been married and divorced multiple times and had children from previous relationships who remained in Saudi Arabia. This created emotional ties to his homeland that made his exile particularly painful, as well as potential leverage points for those who might want to pressure him. In the months before his death, Jamal had become engaged to Hadise Cengiz, a Turkish graduate student he had met during his travels. Their relationship represented hope for a new beginning in his personal life, even as his professional and political situation remained precarious. Hadise's support and companionship provided emotional stability during a difficult period of adjustment to life in exile. The relationship with Hadise also created practical complications that would ultimately prove fatal. Turkish law required certain documentation for marriage, including divorce papers from Jamal's previous marriages. Obtaining these documents required interaction with Saudi government offices, creating opportunities for surveillance and potential entrapment. It was the need to obtain marriage documentation that ultimately brought Jamal to the Saudi Consulate in Istanbul on October 2, 2018. Jamal's family relationships remained complicated by his exile status and his criticism of the Saudi government. Some family members supported his journalistic work and shared his concerns about the direction of Saudi policy, while others preferred that he maintain a lower profile to avoid bringing unwanted attention to the family. These divisions were painful for Jamal, who valued family connections and traditional Saudi social bonds. Jamal's frequent visits to Turkey in 2018 were partly related to his relationship with Hadise Cengiz, but they also reflected his growing appreciation for Turkey as a relatively free society where Arab intellectuals and journalists could operate without fear of repression. Turkey under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had positioned itself as a champion of press freedom and human rights in the Middle East, though this reputation was not without controversy. Turkey's relationship with Saudi Arabia had been strained for several years due to competing visions for the future of the Middle East and disagreements over various regional conflicts. The Turkish government's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and its criticism of authoritarian governments in the Arab world put it at odds with Saudi policy under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This geopolitical tension would later influence how Turkish authorities responded to Jamal's disappearance. Jamal's presence in Turkey was not secret, and it was certainly known to Saudi intelligence services who were monitoring his activities. His regular visits to the country and his relationship with a Turkish citizen created patterns of behavior that could be predicted and exploited. Intelligence analysts later concluded that Saudi authorities had been tracking Jamal's movements for months before his final visit to Istanbul. The choice of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul as the location for Jamal's murder was likely influenced by several factors. Turkey's complex relationship with Saudi Arabia created opportunities for deniable operations, while the consulate status as sovereign Saudi territory provided legal cover for actions that might otherwise be clearly criminal under Turkish law. The location also offered logistical advantages for planning and executing a complex operation. In the weeks leading up to his death, Jamal's writing had become increasingly critical of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his policies. His Washington Post column published on September 18, 2018, was particularly sharp in its assessment of the Crown Prince's record on human rights and political reform. The column argued that MBS's promises of modernization were hollow because they were not accompanied by genuine political liberalization or respect for human rights. Jamal's final columns also addressed the broader implications of authoritarian rule in the Arab world, connecting the situation in Saudi Arabia to similar patterns of repression in other countries. He argued that the Arab Spring's failure had led to a new generation of authoritarian leaders who used modernization rhetoric to justify continued political oppression. This analysis was seen by many as a direct challenge to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's legitimacy and vision. During this period, Jamal also gave several interviews to international media outlets in which he expanded on the themes addressed in his written work. These interviews were widely circulated and helped establish him as one of the most prominent critics of the Saudi government operating from exile. His articulate and knowledgeable commentary made him a sought-after source for journalists and policymakers trying to understand developments in Saudi Arabia. The decision to visit the Saudi consulate in Istanbul was motivated by purely personal reasons, the need to obtain documentation for his planned marriage to Hadisih Cengiz. Jamal was reportedly nervous about entering Saudi sovereign territory, given his status as a critic of the government, but he believed that the routine nature of the transaction and the international attention that would follow any mistreatment would protect him from serious harm. On the morning of October 2, 2018, Jamal Khashoggi arrived at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul accompanied by his fiancée, Hadisih Cengiz. He had made an appointment to obtain the divorce documentation he needed for their upcoming marriage, a routine administrative task that should have taken no more than a few hours. Hadisih waited outside the consulate, as Jamal had instructed her to call Turkish authorities if he did not emerge within a reasonable time. What happened inside the Saudi consulate that day would become the subject of intensive investigation by Turkish, American, and international intelligence services. According to evidence gathered by Turkish authorities, Jamal was confronted by a team of Saudi operatives who had arrived in Istanbul specifically for this operation. The team included forensic specialists, intelligence officers, and individuals with close ties to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's inner circle. Turkish intelligence, which had the Saudi consulate under surveillance due to broader tensions between the two countries, recorded audio of what transpired inside the building. According to leaked accounts of these recordings, Jamal was interrogated about his writings and his relationships with other Saudi dissidents. When he refused to cooperate or return to Saudi Arabia, the situation escalated rapidly to violence. The audio recordings allegedly captured Jamal's final moments, including his pleas for mercy and his statements that he could not breathe. The recordings reportedly documented not only his killing but also the subsequent dismemberment of his body by the forensic specialist who had been brought to Istanbul specifically for this purpose. The coldly professional nature of the operation suggested careful planning and high-level authorization. In the immediate aftermath of Jamal's disappearance, Saudi authorities launched a coordinated campaign of denial and disinformation designed to obscure what had happened and avoid accountability for the crime. Initially, Saudi officials claimed that Jamal had left the consulate alive and that they had no knowledge of his whereabouts. They suggested that he might have been abducted by Turkish intelligence services or other hostile actors. As evidence of Saudi involvement became overwhelming, the official story evolved through several iterations. Saudi authorities first claimed that Jamal had died accidentally during a fistfight at the consulate, then acknowledged that his death was the result of a rogue operation conducted without authorization from senior leadership. Throughout these changing narratives, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman maintained that he had no knowledge of or involvement in the operation. The Saudi government's initial response included aggressive efforts to discredit Jamal's reputation and minimize the significance of his death. Saudi media outlets and social media accounts controlled by the government published articles and posts portraying Jamal as a traitor, a terrorist sympathizer, and an enemy of the state. These character assassination attempts were designed to reduce international sympathy for Jamal and deflect criticism of the Saudi government. Saudi authorities also attempted to use their significant economic and political leverage to limit international criticism and investigation of the case. They threatened economic retaliation against countries that criticized their handling of the case and offered financial incentives to allies who supported their version of events. This pressure campaign was partially successful in limiting the international response, particularly among countries with significant economic ties to Saudi Arabia. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan took a personal interest in the Khashoggi case, seeing it as an opportunity to challenge Saudi Arabia's regional influence while positioning Turkey as a defender of press freedom and human rights. Turkish intelligence services launched a comprehensive investigation, using their surveillance of the Saudi consulate and other intelligence resources to build a detailed picture of what had occurred. The Turkish investigation revealed that a team of 15 Saudi operatives had arrived in Istanbul on private jets in the days before Jamal's murder. Many of these individuals were identified as having close ties to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his security apparatus. The investigation also uncovered evidence of advanced planning, including the rental of vehicles and the booking of hotel rooms by members of the hit team. Turkish authorities strategically leaked information about their investigation to international media outlets, maintaining pressure on Saudi Arabia while building international support for a thorough investigation. These leaks included details about the composition of the hit team, the timeline of events, and excerpts from the audio recordings made inside the consulate. The gradual release of information kept the case in international headlines for months. The Turkish investigation was complicated by diplomatic considerations and the need to balance criticism of Saudi Arabia with broader regional interests. Turkey was involved in several regional conflicts where Saudi cooperation was important, and President Erdogan needed to calibrate his response to avoid permanent damage to Turkish-Saudi relations while still holding the kingdom accountable for the murder. The Central Intelligence Agency conducted its own investigation into Jamal's murder, using signals intelligence, human sources, and other classified methods to determine what had happened and who was responsible. According to leaked reports, the CIA concluded with high confidence that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had directly ordered Jamal's assassination, a finding that contradicted Saudi denials of high-level involvement. The CIA's assessment was based on multiple streams of intelligence, including intercepted communications between Saudi officials, analysis of the hit team's composition and authorities, and the pattern of previous Saudi operations against dissidents. Intelligence analysts noted that an operation of this scale and sensitivity could not have been conducted without authorization from the highest levels of the Saudi government. The American intelligence community's findings created significant political pressure on the Trump administration to respond forcefully to the murder. However, President Donald Trump and his senior advisors were reluctant to take actions that might damage the U.S.-Saudi relationship, particularly given Saudi Arabia's importance as an oil producer and arms purchaser. This tension between intelligence findings and political considerations influenced the American response throughout the crisis. Congress, particularly the Senate, took a more aggressive stance than the executive branch, with senators from both parties calling for sanctions against Saudi Arabia and a re-evaluation of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Several congressional investigations were launched, and legislation was introduced to limit arms sales to the kingdom and impose sanctions on officials responsible for human rights violations. The Khashoggi murder created the most significant crisis in Saudi Arabia's international relations since the September 11, 2001 attacks. Countries around the world condemned the killing and called for accountability, though the specific responses varied based on each nation's relationship with the kingdom and their assessment of their own interests. European Union countries generally took a stronger stance than the United States, with several nations imposing sanctions on Saudi officials and limiting diplomatic engagement with the kingdom. Germany went furthest, suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia and calling for a European Union-wide arms embargo. The United Kingdom and France were more measured in their responses, balancing criticism with concerns about economic relationships and regional stability. The international business community also responded to the murder, with many companies and investors withdrawing from Saudi events and projects. The Future Investment Initiative, Saudi Arabia's signature economic conference, saw numerous high-profile cancellations as business leaders sought to distance themselves from the kingdom. This economic pressure was particularly concerning for Saudi authorities because it threatened Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's economic diversification plans. International media coverage of the case was extensive and largely critical of Saudi Arabia's handling of the situation. The fact that Jamal was a journalist working for a prominent American newspaper created strong solidarity within the international media community, leading to sustained coverage that kept pressure on Saudi authorities. This media attention made it difficult for the case to fade from public consciousness, as might have happened with other human rights violations. Under international pressure, Saudi Arabia eventually put 11 individuals on trial for their role in Jamal's murder. The trials were conducted in secret, with limited information provided to the public or to international observers. 5 defendants were sentenced to death, while others received prison terms of varying lengths. However, international observers noted that none of the senior officials who likely authorized the operation were among those charged. The Saudi trials were widely criticized as inadequate and designed more to deflect international pressure than to achieve genuine justice. The secrecy surrounding the proceedings made it impossible to verify whether the defendants had actually participated in the murder or whether they were being scapegoated to protect more senior officials. The failure to charge any high-level officials reinforced international skepticism about Saudi Arabia's commitment to accountability. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman continued to deny any knowledge of or involvement in Jamal's murder, despite intelligence assessments to the contrary. In interviews with international media, he acknowledged that the murder had occurred on his watch and accepted full responsibility as the kingdom's de facto leader, but maintained that he had not authorized the operation and had been unaware of the plot. The Crown Prince's public statements about the case evolved over time, from initial denials that any murder had occurred to acknowledgments that mistakes had been made by overzealous subordinates. However, he consistently rejected any suggestion that he had personally ordered Jamal's killing or that the murder represented official Saudi policy toward dissidents and critics. Agnes Callamard, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial, Summary or Arbitrary Executions, conducted an independent investigation into Jamal's murder. Her investigation, published in June 2019, concluded that the murder constituted an extrajudicial killing for which the state of Saudi Arabia was responsible under international law. Callamard's report was particularly critical of the Saudi government's investigation and trials, which she characterized as a mockery of justice designed to protect those who had actually authorized the murder. She noted that the evidence strongly suggested that the murder had been premeditated and authorized at high levels of the Saudi government, contradicting official Saudi claims that it was a rogue operation. The UN investigation also examined the broader context of Saudi repression against dissidents and critics, noting that Jamal's murder was part of a pattern of increasingly aggressive actions against those who challenged the government's policies or authority. The report documented other cases of Saudi harassment, imprisonment, and violence against activists, journalists, and political opponents. Calamard's recommendations included targeted sanctions against senior Saudi officials, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and a thorough international investigation into the murder. She also called for reforms to consular law to prevent diplomatic facilities from being used for criminal purposes and for stronger international protections for journalists and human rights defenders. Jamal's murder sent shockwaves through the international journalism community and raised serious concerns about the safety of journalists, particularly those covering authoritarian governments or sensitive political topics. The fact that the murder occurred in a diplomatic facility of a country that was ostensibly allied with the United States demonstrated that even prominent journalists working for major publications were not immune from state violence. Press freedom organizations documented a significant increase in threats and attacks against journalists following Jamal's murder, suggesting that his killing may have emboldened other authoritarian governments to take aggressive action against critical media coverage. The message sent by the murder was that no journalist, regardless of their profile or institutional backing, was beyond the reach of determined state actors. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of exiled journalists who operate outside their home countries but remain targets of their government's intelligence services. Many journalists from authoritarian countries face a difficult choice between self-censorship and the risk of retaliation, and Jamal's murder demonstrated that this retaliation could be lethal even when journalists believed they were safe in friendly countries. International journalism organizations responded to the murder by establishing new safety protocols and support systems for threatened journalists. However, they also acknowledged that these measures could only provide limited protection against state actors with significant resources and international reach. The case underscored the need for stronger international legal frameworks to protect journalists and hold governments accountable for attacks on press freedom. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi fundamentally altered Saudi Arabia's international reputation and relationships in ways that continue to affect the kingdom's foreign policy and economic development efforts. The widespread international condemnation and continued skepticism about Saudi explanations damaged the country's soft power and made it more difficult to attract international investment and partnerships. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who had previously been welcomed in Western capitals as a reformist leader, found himself increasingly isolated internationally. His planned visits to several countries were cancelled or postponed, and business leaders who had previously sought partnerships with Saudi Arabia became more cautious about associating with the kingdom. The murder also complicated Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States, traditionally its most important international partnership. While the Trump administration avoided severe sanctions or other punitive measures, the Biden administration took a harder line, declassifying intelligence reports about the murder and imposing sanctions on Saudi officials. The case became a significant factor in broader U.S. policy toward the kingdom. Economically, the murder created obstacles for Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 reform program, which relied heavily on international investment and partnerships. The reputational damage made it more difficult to attract the foreign capital and expertise needed to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil dependence. Some international companies and investors continued to avoid Saudi projects years after the murder. Despite extensive international pressure and investigation, accountability for Jamal's murder remains incomplete. While several lower-level operatives were tried and convicted in Saudi Arabia, most international observers believe that the senior officials who authorized the operation have escaped justice. This outcome reflects the challenges of holding powerful state actors accountable for human rights violations, particularly when they have significant economic and political leverage. Various international legal mechanisms have been invoked in attempts to achieve accountability, including criminal complaints filed in several countries under universal jurisdiction principles. However, these efforts have been limited by diplomatic immunity protections and the reluctance of some governments to pursue cases that might damage important bilateral relationships. The case has become a symbol of the broader struggle for accountability in international human rights law. Advocates argue that the failure to hold Saudi Arabia fully accountable for the murder sends a dangerous message to other authoritarian governments about the consequences of attacking journalists and dissidents. They continue to push for stronger international legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. Some progress toward accountability has been achieved through targeted sanctions and other diplomatic measures, but these fall short of the comprehensive justice that Jamal's supporters and human rights advocates have demanded. The case remains a test of the international community's commitment to protecting journalists and human rights defenders from state violence. The Khashoggi case highlighted the sophisticated surveillance capabilities that modern authoritarian states can deploy against their critics, even when those critics are operating in foreign countries. Saudi intelligence services were able to track Jamal's movements, monitor his communications, and plan a complex operation on foreign soil, demonstrating the reach of contemporary state surveillance apparatus. Intelligence agencies later revealed that Saudi Arabia had purchased advanced surveillance technology from various international vendors, including software that could track the movements and communications of dissidents and critics. This technology enabled the kingdom to maintain detailed knowledge of Jamal's activities, relationships, and travel patterns, information that was crucial to planning the operation against him. The case also raised important questions about the responsibilities of technology companies that sell surveillance equipment to authoritarian governments. While such sales are often justified as legitimate security cooperation, the Khashoggi murder demonstrated how these technologies could be used for criminal purposes that violate international law and human rights. The use of diplomatic facilities for surveillance and violent operations represented a significant violation of international norms governing consular services. The Vienna Convention on Consular Relations explicitly prohibits the use of diplomatic premises for activities incompatible with consular functions, yet the Saudi consulate in Istanbul was converted into what amounted to an execution chamber. The international media response to Jamal's murder was unprecedented in its scope and intensity, reflecting both the shocking nature of the crime and Jamal's status as a member of the journalism community. Major news organizations devoted extensive resources to investigating and covering the case, treating it not just as a diplomatic crisis but as an attack on press freedom itself. The Washington Post, where Jamal had worked as a columnist, led much of the international coverage and advocacy efforts. The newspaper published his final column posthumously, along with extensive investigative reporting about his murder and its aftermath. The Post's coverage helped maintain international attention on the case and pressure for accountability. Social media played a crucial role in spreading awareness of the case and building international pressure for justice. The hashtag #JusticeForJamal became a rallying cry for press freedom advocates and human rights organizations worldwide. The real-time nature of social media coverage made it difficult for Saudi authorities to control the narrative or limit the spread of damaging information. Public opinion polling in numerous countries showed strong condemnation of the murder and support for holding Saudi Arabia accountable. This public pressure influenced government policies and business decisions, contributing to the diplomatic and economic costs that the kingdom faced as a result of the crime. Jamal's murder occurred within a broader global context of increasing attacks on journalists and press freedom. According to press freedom organizations, the number of journalists killed, imprisoned, or attacked for their work had been rising steadily in the years leading up to 2018, reflecting the growing hostility of authoritarian governments toward independent media. The case highlighted several troubling trends in attacks on journalists, including the increasing targeting of exiled journalists who had sought safety in foreign countries, the use of sophisticated surveillance technology to track and threaten media workers, and the willingness of some governments to conduct violent operations on foreign soil. The murder also demonstrated how authoritarian governments had become more brazen in their attacks on press freedom, calculating that the international community's response would be limited by economic and political considerations. This calculation proved partially correct, as the international response, while significant, fell short of the comprehensive accountability that might have deterred similar future attacks. Press freedom organizations used the case to highlight the need for stronger international protections for journalists, including legal frameworks that would make it easier to prosecute those responsible for attacks on media workers and provide better support for threatened journalists. The murder had significant implications for Saudi Arabia's business relationships and economic development plans. The kingdom's attempts to diversify its economy and attract international investment were complicated by the reputational damage resulting from the case, as businesses became more cautious about associating with Saudi projects and officials. The Future Investment Initiative, Saudi Arabia's flagship economic conference often referred to as Davos in the desert, saw numerous high-profile cancellations following the murder. Major business leaders, technology executives, and financial institutions withdrew their participation, dealing a significant blow to the kingdom's efforts to position itself as a modern business destination. Several international companies and investment funds announced that they were suspending or reviewing their business relationships with Saudi Arabia pending clarification of the circumstances surrounding Jamal's death. While some of these suspensions were later lifted, the case created lasting concerns about reputational risks associated with Saudi partnerships. The economic impact extended beyond immediate business relationships to affect the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund and other investment vehicles. Some international partners became more reluctant to work with Saudi financial institutions, and the country faced increased scrutiny of its investments in foreign companies and projects. The Khashoggi case established several important precedents in international law, particularly regarding state responsibility for extraterritorial killings and the use of diplomatic facilities for criminal purposes. Legal scholars and practitioners continue to study the case as an example of how international legal frameworks apply to sophisticated state-sponsored violence. The case demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of existing international legal mechanisms for addressing human rights violations. While various international bodies condemned the murder and called for accountability, the limited practical consequences highlighted the gaps in enforcement capabilities when dealing with powerful state actors. Several countries attempted to use universal jurisdiction principles to investigate and potentially prosecute those responsible for the murder, but these efforts were largely thwarted by diplomatic immunity protections and political considerations. The case highlighted the need for stronger international legal frameworks that could overcome these obstacles. The United Nations investigation and report provided an important legal analysis of the case that will likely influence future international responses to similar crimes. The UN Special Rapporteur's conclusions about state responsibility and the inadequacy of Saudi Arabia's domestic investigation established important precedents for evaluating government responses to such incidents. Beyond its political and diplomatic significance, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi represented a profound personal tragedy that affected his family, friends, and colleagues around the world. His children, who remained in Saudi Arabia, faced difficult circumstances as they grieved their father's death while living under the authority of the government responsible for killing him. Hadissi Cengiz, Jamal's fiancée who had waited outside the consulate on the day of his murder, became an advocate for justice and accountability. Her testimony about Jamal's final days and her efforts to seek justice provided a human face to the international campaign for accountability. Her courage in speaking out despite obvious personal risks demonstrated the kind of commitment to truth and justice that had characterized Jamal's own work. The impact on Jamal's professional colleagues and the broader journalism community was also significant. Many journalists who had known and worked with Jamal felt not only grief at his loss but also fear for their own safety. The murder sent a chilling message about the risks faced by journalists who criticized authoritarian governments, even when working for prestigious international publications. The personal tragedy extended to the loss of Jamal's voice and perspective at a critical time in Middle Eastern history. His unique combination of insider knowledge, analytical capability, and moral clarity had made him one of the most important commentators on regional affairs. His death deprived the world of insights and analysis that could have contributed to better understanding and policymaking regarding the Middle East. The Khashoggi case provided important lessons for news organizations, governments, and international institutions about protecting journalists and maintaining press freedom in an increasingly hostile global environment. These lessons continue to influence policies and practices aimed at supporting independent journalism. News organizations learned about the need for enhanced security protocols for journalists working on sensitive topics or covering authoritarian governments. Many publications strengthened their security assessments and support systems for reporters and columnists who might face threats because of their work. The case also highlighted the importance of institutional support for threatened journalists. The Washington Post's unwavering support for Jamal, both before and after his death, demonstrated how news organizations could stand behind their journalists even when facing pressure from powerful interests. Governments and international institutions were forced to confront the limitations of existing protections for journalists and the need for stronger enforcement mechanisms. The case accelerated discussions about new international frameworks for protecting media workers and holding governments accountable for attacks on press freedom. The journalism community also learned about the importance of solidarity and collective action in responding to attacks on press freedom. The unified response to Jamal's murder, while unable to prevent the crime, demonstrated the power of coordinated advocacy and sustained international pressure. More than 5 years after Jamal's murder, important questions about the case remain unanswered. While the basic facts of what happened on October 2, 2018, are well established, the full extent of the planning, authorization, and cover-up efforts may never be completely known. The location of Jamal's remains continues to be unknown, despite extensive search efforts by Turkish authorities and international investigators. This ongoing mystery adds to the pain of his family and supporters, who have been unable to provide him with a proper burial or final memorial. New information about the case continues to emerge periodically, as journalists and investigators uncover additional details about the operation and its aftermath. These revelations help build a more complete picture of what happened, but they also highlight how much remains unknown about the full scope of the conspiracy. The search for truth extends beyond the specific details of Jamal's murder to broader questions about the nature of authoritarian governance and the methods used by such governments to silence critics. His case has become a lens through which to examine the global assault on press freedom and human rights. Jamal Khashoggi's legacy extends far beyond the circumstances of his death to encompass his life's work as a journalist, his advocacy for press freedom and democratic values, and the ongoing efforts to achieve justice in his case. His writings continue to be studied and cited by scholars, journalists, and policy makers seeking to understand Middle Eastern politics and society. The Jamal Khashoggi Foundation, established by his supporters and colleagues, continues his work by supporting press freedom and human rights advocacy in the Arab world. The foundation provides scholarships, training, and support for journalists and human rights defenders who continue the work that cost Jamal his life. Educational institutions around the world have established programs and initiatives in Jamal's honor, recognizing his contributions to journalism and his sacrifice for press freedom. These programs help ensure that future generations of journalists understand both the importance of independent reporting and the risks that journalists sometimes face in pursuit of truth. The case continues to influence international policy discussions about press freedom, human rights, and the relationship between democratic values and strategic interests. Policy makers regularly cite the Khashoggi case when discussing how to balance economic and security partnerships with authoritarian governments against the need to defend fundamental rights and values. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi represents a watershed moment in the global struggle for press freedom and human rights. The crime was shocking not only for its brutality but also for its brazenness, the willingness of a government to conduct a violent operation against a journalist on foreign soil, apparently calculating that the international response would be manageable. The case exposed the vulnerabilities faced by journalists and human rights defenders in an increasingly connected but also increasingly surveilled world. It demonstrated how modern technology could be used to track and target critics across international borders, and how diplomatic facilities could be weaponized for criminal purposes. At the same time, the international response to the murder showed both the power and the limitations of global efforts to defend press freedom and human rights. The sustained international attention, diplomatic pressure, and economic consequences that Saudi Arabia faced demonstrated that such crimes carry costs. However, the limited practical accountability achieved also showed how difficult it remains to hold powerful state actors responsible for human rights violations. The Khashoggi case will be remembered as a defining moment in the relationship between authoritarian power and independent journalism. It serves as both a warning about the lengths to which some governments will go to silence critics and an inspiration for those who continue to fight for truth and accountability despite the risks. Jamal's own words, written in his final column published posthumously by The Washington Post, provide perhaps the best summary of his legacy and the ongoing struggle he represented. What the Arab world needs most is free expression. Without it, we face a future of silence, oppression and emotional suffocation. His death was an attempt to ensure that silence, but the continuing efforts to seek justice and defend press freedom in his name demonstrate that his voice and message live on. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was not just a crime against one man, but an attack on the principles of free expression, independent journalism, and human dignity that underpin democratic societies. The ongoing fight for justice in his case is therefore not just about accountability for past crimes, but about defending the values and institutions that make free societies possible. In this broader struggle, Jamal's legacy continues to inspire and guide those who refuse to accept that truth, justice, and human rights are negotiable commodities in the pursuit of power and profit.